Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Aurora Clark from Washington State University. And today she'll be telling us about multiscale many-body correlations and structure in chemistry data.
Okay, now I think I have the formal okay to move forward. Thank you very much, Henry. I'm really happy to be able to talk with you all today. I don't get a chance to talk much to kind of more mathematical audiences. And so I've tried to make this discussion today kind of half informational about kind of my perspective about the integration of math and chemistry, and about half in research. And so I want to just, here, why is this not advancing? Give me a sec. There we go. Talk a little bit about my interests. And so obviously I'm a chemist, and in the applications that we do in chemistry, we study complex fluids and their interfaces. And to do that, we use electronic structure or quantum mechanical techniques, as well as statistical mechanics and ensemble sampling. And over the last decade or so, we've worked really, really hard to integrate mathematics into the way in which we analyze and think about our data. And so at a really basic level, I'm very interested in how we can incorporate topology, geometry, and graph theory into fundamental chemistry concepts to develop more accurate models, as well as to inspire new mathematical development. And so some of this mathematical development might be in the context of computational efficiency, or to help reveal more underlying physics, or to push the boundaries of dynamics and complexity in the data that we have. And so I want to just spend a few minutes to try and reiterate something you probably all know well, but I think maybe isn't broadly understood or thought about much kind of by chemists necessarily. Your kind of average organic chemist or analytical chemist might not necessarily think this way, and perhaps people that are in pure math might not necessarily think this way. But, you know, at a very basic level, the fundamental pillars of chemistry, which are quantum mechanics, which I have here on the right, and statistical mechanics, which are here on the left is quantum mechanics, and on the right is statistical mechanics. These are really kind of built upon kind of the very early developments in mathematics, right? And so in quantum mechanics, we have this beautiful differential equation kind of perspective on understanding the behavior of electrons and nuclei. And as part of that, there is tremendous development in linear algebra and functional analysis. And in statistical mechanics, it's, you know, intrinsically tied to probability theory. And even there's a lot of overlap, right, with von Neumann, who understood and was able to cast entropy into a context that was relevant to quantum mechanics as well. And so these two pillars of chemistry, I think, really represent this beautiful intersection of mathematics and chemistry. And I love this picture that I got off the internet of the map of math, because it's very easy for me to point to these areas that underpin very fundamental chemical concepts, whether it's in, you know, linear algebra and group theory, which is a tremendous area in chemistry, as well as measures or numerical analysis. And so when I see this map of mathematics, I see many, many different disciplines in chemistry and chemical concepts. And so there's also lots of interesting and I think historically relevant examples of how chemistry can inspire math, right? When we think of Arthur Cayley did a huge amount of work in chemistry with the enumeration of trying to figure out all the possible ways that you could arrange carbon atoms in kind of a series of organic compounds. And in fact, his enumeration techniques and studies of characteristic polynomials helped future quantum chemists to develop techniques associated with electronic structure. And so there's this really lovely interplay at a historical level of chemistry and math inspiring one another. So, you know, chemists, when we think about kind of what chemists want, we want fundamental theories of how things work. And so in this respect, we're very much like physicists, right? And in fact, many theoretical chemists, I would argue, are applied mathematicians. And so one of the things that chemists and theoretical chemists are really good at is big data. And not necessarily complex data, but big data, yes. And so as an example, in quantum mechanical studies, there are really enormous matrices that often have to be diagonalized. And so as a consequence of this, there's been tremendous development by theoretical chemists in their kind of with their mathematician hats on to develop things like subspace diagonalization schemes that leverage sparsity to allow this to be computationally efficient. But we're not necessarily used to dealing with complex data. And this is because the nature of the complexity of the data that we deal with has really changed dramatically over time. And so this is going to be kind of the emphasis of the talk that I'm going to give today is a bit about the data that we have in chemistry, how we think about our data, and how there are opportunities to go and integrate a lot of the techniques that have been used in the kind of fundamental chemical concepts regime in data analysis. And so I want to spend a couple minutes talking about data in chemistry. And so chemists observe the behavior of particles, right? These particles can be molecules or nuclei. They can be colloids, you know, like when we think about oil and water mixtures and like shaking up a vinaigrette, right? They could, those droplets of oil could be particles. But the point is that whenever we measure something or observe something, we're looking at these particle behaviors and we're looking at the result of the interactions from those particles. And so on the left-hand side, we have a series of non-interacting particles that just exhibit random motion. And on the right-hand side, we have particles that interact with one another, and they correlate their behavior with one another. And so they influence each other's position and time-dependent behavior. And this interaction, this level of interaction that particles can have, can be at a local level where you just have a few bodies or a few particles involved in that correlation, or it can be that the entire system is correlated. And this can happen when you think about phase phenomena like nucleation of ice, or in a phase transition when you form a gel or you go from a liquid to a solid. And so these global interactions can occur across multiple length scales. Another thing that's really important to think about is that these correlations in particle position and time-dependent phenomena can occur, they occur both across time as well as space. And so an event at time t can influence behavior at t plus x. And so this leads to kind of the way in which chemists often think about correlations, which is in the context of correlation functions, which really are derived from probability theory. And so I'm going to give you an example of a time correlation function, just because I told you a second ago about how particle-particle interactions influence behavior in time. And so what we have here is some observable A that's evolving around its average in time and its associated probability distribution function. We can develop a correlation function to watch the behavior of that observable at time t relative to some other time in the future, and we can plot the correlation there, and we can see this nice decay in this correlation function. A bit better of a way to think about this time correlation function, which I really love this illustration that came from Andrei Tokmakov at the University of Chicago, which is, you know, if we look at the behavior of this observable at time t and we shift it by just a little bit, which is going to be the correlation time, then this correlation function is really an overlap integral, which resonates a lot with me and my background in quantum mechanics. We deal with overlap integrals all the time. And so this correlation function is not a function of time, it's a function of the correlation time. But we construct correlation functions both in time as well as in space and across many different variables. And this is how we often analyze and interpret the data that we obtain, either from simulation or experiment. And so when we think about these correlation functions, it might not be obvious, but you have to like think about what they are in advance, right? Like if I want to analyze data, I have to know in my head in advance what correlation function I'm going to construct and see what the result is. And so, you know, if you know what you're looking for, that's great. Sometimes there are what we would call known unknowns, where you might be able to use your chemical intuition to say, okay, I think this correlation function might be relevant, and I might develop the math to create a new correlation function. But the larger issue is about what I would call unknown unknowns, right? Where we have no idea what the correlation function is to create, to be able to study or learn from the data that we have. And this becomes an issue because computational chemistry data is changing significantly, and it has over the last 20 years. And so, you know, there's linear scaling now. Well, we're approaching linear scaling in some quantum mechanical simulation methods, which allows us to now do really large simulations where we're able to capture wave functions evolving in time. People are now trying to develop classical models of entire cells and cell membranes and watch how things permeate cell membranes. And the data that is coming from these simulation techniques is incredibly complex. And so this asks and kind of motivates us to ask an entirely new set of questions from simulation data than we have ever had to ask in the past, right? You could think about how we might analyze and interpret molecular wave functions for really large systems, or how can we look at how electronic structure and the behavior of electrons is correlated to the behavior of nuclei from a statistical perspective. But in order to ask these questions, we have to be able to identify all the processes that are happening, and we have to then find out if those processes are correlated, right? And so this motivates us now to try and develop new tools in what I would call kind of complex data analysis in a chemistry formalism. And the three approaches that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to kind of interweave them and show you examples of how they can be used to study kind of this many-body picture of particle-particle correlations, are graph theory, computational topology, and geometric measures. And so in the context of graph theory, what we're interested in are using graphs to identify patterns and correlations in particle-particle interactions. And for computational topology and geometric measures, what we want to do is we want to understand the result of those particle-particle interactions and understand how they're influencing things like spatial distributions. And so you might have guessed from my introduction that graph theory has been intertwined with the evolution of chemistry concepts. And I showed an example early on of how, chemistry helped inspire Cayley. But in fact, the kind of fundamental way in which we think about molecules is very graph theoretical and has helped us to understand very fundamental concepts in chemistry, like valence, which is just how many edges you have associated with an atom-based node based upon its electronic structure. And there was a huge, there's hundreds of papers on molecular graphs where we have these connectivity patterns based upon covalent bonding between atoms. Molecular graphs are often called chemical graphs, but I would say that chemical graph theory is now much more broad than molecular graphs. And the area of quantum graphs is actually very, very old in chemistry, where they're trying to think about how electrons move along quantum mechanical wires. But now it's very, very popular in things like condensed matter physics and understanding quantum interference and things like this. And so graph theory in chemistry is really exploding and it's all built upon this very long history. Now, in our group, we study lots of different types of graphs, but one of the ones that we've really focused a lot on because of this many body particle interaction kind of picture are what we call intermolecular network graphs. And these are based upon where we take the Cartesian coordinates of particles that are typically molecules, and we look at how those molecules are interacting with one another. And we use a definition of those interactions to take a molecular node and define the interaction between them to be an edge. And so within our simulation data, this allows us to take our Cartesian coordinates, create a graph or network, and if we have time-dependent coordinates, which we typically do, then we have a time-dependent network. And within the context of time-dependent networks of chemical systems, I'm going to give you kind of two examples, maybe three examples of different applications of how we can think about employing very fundamental kind of aspects of graph theory in chemistry. And one of them is spectral graph theory. And so, we know that if we have a graph, we can create an adjacency matrix, we can create a degree matrix. The Laplacian is just the adjacency matrix minus the degree matrix, and we can look at the eigenvalues and eigenvector spectrums of these matrices. And oftentimes, and this forms the basis of spectral graph theory. And there's a lot that you can learn about not just the spectra of eigenvalues and eigenvectors, but from individual eigenvector entries as well. And so one of the techniques that we've used is actually Pagerank, which has been very useful. And I'm just going to go briefly through the derivation of Pagerank and just to illustrate why it's useful in a chemistry context. And so Pagerank is derived from the adjacency matrix, and then we divide it by the number of links for each node to create a probability matrix. And so this probability matrix M is column stochastic, which is really nice because it allows us to leverage the Perrin-Frobenius theorem. So one is the largest eigenvalue from all of the eigenvectors, and the eigenvalue vector that has eigenvalue 1 will only have positive entries, and the sum of all of those entries is 1. And so this is really nice because this provides kind of this internal normalization, if you will, of the span of PageRank values that are present. The PageRank values are actually the entries in that eigenvector that has eigenvalue 1. So for each of those nodes, each of the node entries in the eigenvector, those are the PageRank values. And so this allows this internal normalization. So I'm automatically scaled between 0 and 1. Now, obviously the Perrin-Frobenius theorem is true for any column stochastic matrix. And I kind of jumped ahead a little bit because if you just wanted to solve the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of this probability matrix, you could use something like the power convergence theorem and things like this, but it's really hard to converge if you have large numbers of nodes, or if you have dangling nodes. And so this becomes a problem because a lot of chemical systems can have this characteristic. And so, chemical systems like the internet have this characteristic. And so what Google did, or not what Google, what Sergey Brin and Larry Page did is they made a slight modification of this, this probability matrix M and added a dampening factor that allowed us to control some of the convergence characteristics associated with the eigenvectors and eigenvalues. And so this PageRank vector, the Google matrix is still a column stochastic matrix. And so the PageRank vector is the eigenvector of the Google matrix that corresponds to eigenvalue 1. And we take each of those entries is the PageRank value of that node. So, and it's got this internal normalization characteristic in there. So if you use an unweighted graph and you calculate the PageRank, you get what I would call a discontinuous PageRank value. So if you smoothly, like say you change the connectivity pattern in a smooth way from one pattern to another, you will get big jumps in PageRank's value. If you use a weighted matrix, you can get a continuous and smooth transformation of a PageRank as you move from one pattern to another pattern, for example. And so if you use a weighted adjacency matrix, then you can just adopt and rederive PageRank in the context of this weighting scheme. And this allows you to come up with this nice smooth PageRank description. So what can you do with this smooth PageRank description? Because I want to talk about it in the context of the continuity and how this allows us to understand many-body motion. And so let's say I have a molecule here. This is actually aluminate. There's an aluminum here, and it's got 4 OH groups attached. It's a tetrahedron, and it's vibrating, okay? And so as it's vibrating, you have not just the aluminum OH vibrations going like this, but you also have bending motions as well. And so this is a correlated motion associated with vibration. And so if I monitor the PageRank of the aluminum based upon a network that has the connectivity patterns between the OH groups as well as with the aluminum, so it's this nice small network, I can look at the oscillations in PageRank, and I can calculate its autocorrelation function, which is just the self correlation function. So how does PageRank correlate with itself, right? And when I do that, that autocorrelation function, I can take the Fourier transform of that autocorrelation function, and that gives me a characteristic time scale of the fluctuations in PageRank of the aluminum as the aluminate is vibrating and bending. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the peak, the frequency of this PageRank autocorrelation function is the averaged fundamental frequency of the normal modes that occur in the aluminate. So the normal modes, normally when we calculate vibrational motion, we do it by calculating the Hessian and then diagonalizing the Hessian and obtaining what we call the normal modes that represent these group motion frequencies. And so these frequencies can occur in both symmetric and antisymmetric ways in the aluminum, where all of the OHs go in and out at the same time versus some going in and out at opposite times. But the PageRank is capturing the ensemble average of all of them. And so what this is telling you is that PageRank is capturing this many body motion of the OH groups vibrating and bending around the aluminum. I've made it the way we've done it. We can't distinguish between these types of motions right now, the symmetric and the antisymmetric. We could if we wanted to, but it is showing that it is able to capture this many body motion, which is really kind of the important take home message of this that I wanted to tell you. Now, the fact that we can capture many body motion is actually very, very useful to us as chemists, because because chemical reactions involve the motions of many different particles, right? So if I have a chemical reaction, let's say I have 2 particles and I want to bring them together. I have 2 particles and they're going to form a new bond. And especially if those particles are surrounded by other particles, there's correlation in that motion. And so this can occur when you're in a liquid. So imagine a saltwater solution, and you've got like table salt that you've dumped in water, and you have sodium ions and you have chlorine ions, and they come together and they're surrounded by water molecules. And when they come together, these two ions, those water molecules have to completely rearrange. And so this process, which is called ion pairing, when the two ions come together, involves the collective motion of all of the water molecules getting out of the way in order for these ions to see one another. And so we can actually use the fact that Pagerank can capture this change in the network, the correlated many body particle motion of the water molecules rearranging, to map out what we would call the underlying energy landscape associated with that process, which is what we have right here. So here's Pagerank versus distance, and these two ions that we're bringing together. This is how the energy changes as the water molecules have to rearrange. And so we can use Pagerank as this many body descriptor to cause chemical reactions to occur and watch the energies change, or to just observe the energetics changing as a function of the correlated motion. So this is actually a very useful tool for chemists. So I want to now take a couple minutes and I want to zoom in and let's go away from molecules and let's think about nuclei, right? Because when we think about what I've been able to show you thus far is kind of how this topological descriptor of the graphs associated with molecules interacting with one another, how we can use these topological descriptors to control and observe many body motion. But there's also really interesting data if we zoom into the level of nuclei. And so a lot of times we think of nuclei as being classical particles, but they actually have a quantum mechanical characteristic. And this quantum mechanical characteristic actually influences chemistry and has interesting data structure associated with it. So the way in which chemists take a classical hard sphere particle like a nucleus, and they want to understand its uncertainty in its position, which is caused by quantum mechanics because of wave particle duality, is to mimic that hard sphere particle as being a bunch of small particles that are all tied together by little tiny harmonic oscillator springs. And so these little tiny harmonic oscillator springs can vibrate and move. And this simulation approach is called path integral or ring polymer molecular dynamics simulation methods. But this allows basically, because of wave particle duality, the position of the nucleus can smear out. And by having this ring polymer approach, we can mimic that smearing out. And so what we wanted to understand was kind of quantum delocalization in nuclei and understand the shapes of nuclei as they were undergoing different processes. And so there's a number, like people who are a bit more on the physics side we can force this to occur, and we can study the variation in particle properties as you cause and impose on the system more and more quantum delocalization. A really good example is the Cobb-Anderson forming glass, where you basically just are changing kind of the de Broglie wavelength of the particles, and you can make these glass particles either highly localized, like on the left-hand side, or highly delocalized, like on the right-hand side. And you can see very visually how these have really obvious changes to the nuclear shape, right? Something that's much more subtle but realistic, more realistic from a chemistry perspective, is proton transfer. So proton transfer is a process that occurs in acids. So, hydrochloric acid, acetic acid, vinegar, right? And what happens is that you have a hydrogen atom that gets transferred between water molecules or between acid molecules. And so here's a really good example. This is, we have an excess proton, an excess H plus that's attached to this water, and to make it H3O plus, which is our acidic molecule. And this hydrogen atom transfers from one water to another water. So this excess proton transfers from one to another. And so you can kind of see that following. It goes from being the central oxygen, where oxygen is red here, to this lower right-hand oxygen. And in order for hydrogen to do this, the hydrogen nucleus itself has some uncertainty in its position. Its quantum mechanical characteristics become manifested, but they're very, very subtle. It's much harder to observe this than in the top case. And so the simulation data that you get from these ring polymer simulations is a time-dependent set of the positions of all of the beads on that ring polymer. And we're going to ask two questions. We're going to ask, how do we quantify the shape differences? And then we're going to ask a question that top question, that Q1 has been asked before, but needs new tools to help define shape. Q2 is something that has not really been asked before, which is, are there differences in the fluctuations in shape? And so, you know, we saw with the Pagerank example how the Fourier transform of the topological descriptor gave us this dynamical information, right? And we're going to take kind of a similar approach here, where we're going to see if we can take the Fourier transform of some metric of shape to be able to understand the characteristic fluctuations of this ring polymer representation of a nucleus. And so we're going to quantify shape differences in a couple different ways. And so there's a lot of traditional shape metrics, like the radius of gyration. And from the radius of gyration tensors, you can get things like asphericity and acylindricity and anisotropy. And we're also going to do it with persistent homology, which I'm going to presume that all of you guys are relatively familiar with in the context of thinking about it as kind of a filtration of graph distances, the evolution of the graph as a function of filtration distances between nodes from a point particle kind of perspective. And so in the context of these shape metrics, we can compare this Cobb-Anderson glass versus this proton transfer case. And in the Cobb-Anderson glass, you get these very different radii of gyration for these two different types of particles, where you can very easily distinguish the shapes of these two very different delocalized versus localized particles. In the proton transfer case, the radius of gyration is almost identical, right? It's set to the 4th decimal place. But you do see some subtle and statistically different data if you look at the distribution of the zero-dimensional persistent homology, so the number of intersections that we have as a function of the radii as we're zooming out and looking at this filtered graph kind of scenario. And so you do see these differences that pass a student's t-test, but they're not, I mean, they're better maybe than the RSOG, but they're still very overlapping. This tells you that you know, the shape is kind of a very hard thing to differentiate in this proton transfer case, I would say. What's more interesting is thinking about the fluctuations in shape. And so to understand the fluctuations in shape, we first look at the Cobb-Anderson glass, and what we did was we looked at the Wasserstein distance between the difference in the barcode distributions between adjacent snapshots in time. And so we've got one distribution that represents the shape at time t, and then we've got another distribution that represents the shape at t+1, and we're looking at, you know, the amount of work needed to transform that one distribution into another distribution. And you can see very clearly in this really well differentiated case that the type A fluctuations are much more broad than the type B, right? So type A molecules, which are very delocalized, are fluctuating in their shape way more than the type B, which are much more localized. So if you take the Fourier transform of the Wasserstein distance, then you can get that characteristic time scale of the shape fluctuation, which now gives us an idea that hasn't really been thought about a huge amount in the chemistry literature, which is kind of the dynamic piece of quantum delocalization. And you can see this principal component analysis of the Fourier transform captures about 90% of the variance between that's observed in the Fourier transform. Similarly, we can do this exact same thing in our acid data, which happens to be hydrochloric acid. And very nicely, you see huge differences actually in the fluctuations in the shape. So although the average shape couldn't be really well differentiated based upon shape metrics or even the persistent homology, it was a little bit better, but not tremendously better. The fluctuations are tremendously different. And you can again see this in the Fourier transform of the Wasserstein distances adjacent in time. So The proton transferring case has the hydrogen atoms that are undergoing proton transfer, that are maybe their average shapes aren't getting smeared out in a very well differentiable way relative to the hydrogen atoms that aren't, but the fluctuations in their shape are very, very different. And so this allows us to now understand and kind of have a handle on those hydrogen atoms that are undergoing this reaction. So now I want to, so hopefully now you've seen a bit about kind of the dynamics of correlation behavior, right? And kind of the motion of many body interactions across time. Now I want to pivot a little bit and talk about the effects of many body interactions on space. And so this is going to be more from an ensemble averaged kind of perspective, where we look at all of the data and we're trying, instead of capturing and monitoring the data in time, we're just going to look at all of it. And try to understand what the effects are of many body correlations upon what we call spatial heterogeneity. And so to understand spatial heterogeneity a little bit more, really these many body interactions derive from competition of particle-particle interactions. And so what you have is you've got a whole bunch of particles, and like particles of type A and type B, and their interaction energies amongst themselves and with each other are somewhat similar. And what this causes then, if we kind of tune those energetics, what happens is that we can really change the amount of organization in the system or disorder in the system a huge amount. So as an example, we can think about just what's called a Lennard-Jones fluid, which are just hard spheres interacting via a Lennard-Jones interatomic potential, which just kind of looks like you've got a little kind of well like this. And this, what we have particles that are slightly different sizes. And so the slightly smaller particles are able to get together a little bit closer than the slightly bigger particles. And what this causes is what we call heterogeneity in this fluid. So instead of all the particles just being homogeneously distributed and randomly distributed throughout the system, we have small bits of aggregation that can occur of these smaller particles relative to these bigger particles. And this aggregation occurs across scale. And so we take a graph theoretical perspective and we make graphs of our particle-particle interactions, and we want to understand this hierarchical organization. And so the tool that we use to do this is modularity optimization, which helps us to kind of identify clusters in a generalized and multi-scale manner. And so the intent of modularity optimization, and unfortunately I don't have, I should have put, there's a reference that's missing in here. There's a really important reference from 2008, which I can dig up for you guys. But if you just Google modularity optimization, you will find it really easily, because there's a very computationally efficient algorithm that was developed in 2008 for this purpose. And so the intent of modularity optimization is that you're trying to find a cluster partition. So you take the entire system, you're trying to partition it up into clusters that maximizes Q. And so what we have is Q is equal to 1 over n, which is the total number of nodes, times the sum over the edge weight between pairs of nodes, minus the total number, the multiplication of the total number of edges between nodes, edge weights between nodes, times this delta function, which is if the two nodes are part of the same cluster or different cluster. Now, if you take a step back, what this equation is doing, and by maximizing Q, is saying, how can I partition this system into different clusters so that the internal connectivity of the nodes in the cluster are maximized and the external connectivity between clusters is minimized. So here's an example of that. So here we start off with a really simple graph where each of the nodes are part of a different cluster that I've indicated by different colors. And what I'm going to do is systematically, I'm trying to maximize Q. And so first what happens is you can see that this brown node gets is a part now of the black cluster here. In the next iteration, this is done iteratively. So what you do is you kind of go through and you change the identity of every node into the cluster that it is in an iterative way to figure out which one maximizes Q the most. And so in the next iteration, this brown node here becomes a green node. Then I expand the black cluster a little bit. Then I expand the green cluster. Then these lower guys all become part of a gray cluster. And so what I start off with, where all my nodes in my graph are all part of different clusters, now I've partitioned it into 3 clusters where I've maximized that internal connectivity and minimized the external connectivity. And so getting back to this Lennard-Jones fluid, here's an example of modularity optimization that has been performed on this Lennard-Jones fluid. And this has been done in what we call a hierarchical way. So you can do this in passes. So you run through this algorithm to say, okay, I start off with my total network, and I end up with my network based on 3 clusters. And then you can collapse those clusters into nodes and create a new network that allows you to then do what we call coarse graining of the network, right? So every cluster becomes a new node. I create a new network. I can go through that network again, create new clusters, collapse them again into new nodes. And that's what's been done in this Lennard-Jones fluid. So here, these little red balls are kind of the first pass of the modularity optimization. And in the second pass, I get these much larger domains of particles that can now be differentiated from one another. And so this is a really nice example of how I can go from the graph theoretical perspective, look at the connectivity patterns in an ensemble over all of this data to parse out this spatial heterogeneity that's present. Now, that Lennard-Jones system is pretty simple in the context of chemistry. And so we're going to pivot now into some tools that are needed for more realistic systems in my last 5 or 6 minutes here. And so the systems that we're going to talk about are oil-water interfaces. And so we can all think about, putting in droplets of oil into water and they bead up, and in this pretty picture, they've put food coloring in them so you can see them all. But if we were to zoom in on the surface of any one of these little oil droplets, and we change the conditions of the water, we could change the structure of that surface significantly. Sometimes that surface might be just kind of this if I zoom in enough, it looks flat, right, kind of surface. In other systems, I will form what are called protrusions on the surface, as there's a little bit of permeability and some water molecules mix in a little bit with the oil. If I push this even further and maybe change the characteristic of the oil, I can actually kind of get membrane-like structures on these surfaces. And so these surfaces have really immense diversity in their structural organization. And modularity optimization can be used, and we used it to identify these cluster protrusions. And they represent a really hard case from a graph theoretical perspective, because these clusters have very sparse internal connectivity on top of a very heterogeneous network. But the question is are there other ways to do this? And so one of the ways that through collaboration with Bala Krishnamurthy, which I'm going to elaborate on in a couple minutes here, is to take a more geometric approach. And so the flat norm technique is really kind of based, has been applied mostly in what's called in image denoising. But basically, it's a way to identify structures or volumes above a flat surface. So you can think about like noise you might have on top of an image. So you have an underlying image and then you have all this noise and you want to remove the noise. We're kind of taking the same perspective here, and I'm going to go through more mathematically in just a second here, but we have this surface of this oil-water interface, and we have all these structures on the surface, and we want to pull off those structures so we can analyze them. So we're taking a very similar kind of approach here. And so the idea here is that we have, we're doing an optimization basically problem or a minimization problem where we have this function f, and we're trying to minimize if we pull off a specific area. So this is in 2D, if we pull off a specific area, what's the minimum curve underneath this that corresponds to this area that I'm pulling off? And the area that is being pulled off is governed by this lambda variable. And so in a slightly more complex example that looks a little bit more like an interface, what we can do is we can systematically tune lambda, and we can look to see how much area is pulled off of this 2D surface. And so here's an example at lambda equals lambda plus 1. Actually, let me take a step back. So so this green guy is my lambda equals lambda 1, and I start off with my t, and I do t minus delta s, and I pull off this green part, which removes these two brown pieces, and I'm left with this smooth green curve underneath. Then I can change lambda, and this is the case where lambda 2 becomes much less than lambda 1, and I pull off way more of that surface, and that is then this smooth curve underneath. And so by tuning lambda, I can systematically change the areas that I'm taking off this 2D curve. Now, in 3 dimensions, for the surfaces that we have at our oil-water interface, we need to discretize our surface, which originally is made of molecules, into kind of a tetrahedral volume mesh. And 1 lambda doesn't work, right? Because I have this huge variation in all of these structures, right? If I just want to use 1 lambda, I'm not going to pull off all the structures that I want. And so really uniquely, when we were doing this collaboration, Bala suggested that we take a probabilistic approach that was kind of where we systematically scanned different lambda values and kept track of the components that were pulled off of the surface as a function of this. And I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly because there's a couple points that are really important to me. But in either case, if we track the components as a function of the lambda that we're slowly pulling off, and we monitor the volume, and we can impose a minimum threshold of volume. So for example, it doesn't really make sense to allow lambda to pull off a volume that's smaller than the size of a molecule, right? I mean, because the molecule is making up the surface. So we can keep track of how our components live as a function of us decreasing our lambdas and also monitoring the volumes, which is what we call this ratio cutoff, as we do this. And when we do that, and keep track of all components, we can look them all up, and so we can see which ones are alive at which lambda values and which volumes, and then we can get a probability of how likely is it that some surface structure is going to live and survive as we scan through these lambda values. And so what's really nice about this is we had a really beautiful data set of about 200 of these structures that visually by eye, we looked for to say, yeah, I think as a chemist, this looks like a protrusion, or no, I don't think it looks like a protrusion. And we're able to capture all of them. We had some small positives, some small false positives, and these kind of result when you have a big dip in the surface and you have a little tiny protrusion in the dip, it becomes harder to see. But for the most part, with this, if you're looking at the top 100 kind of protrusions that you see, they all match really nicely with the ones that are observed. And if we kind of look at the ones that are less and less likely, we start to introduce more errors. But you can see some of these protrusions right here, right? They have these really complex shapes associated with them. And so this is really cool because it brings up the ability now to think about these protrusions, these surface structures, as kind of point cloud versus surface representations. And so some of the ongoing work, I've got a student who's really interested in kind of comparing the persistent homology versus the sublevel set persistent homology that allows us to try and understand these shapes to see which one is better for kind of encoding protrusion shape and for us to learn some chemistry from that. So now I'm just going to spend a minute here at the very end of my talk. I want to talk a little bit about education and training because a lot of this work, has evolved tremendously based upon a shift in the way in which I train my students and the way in which I do collaborations. And so, early on, we started doing a lot of this graph theory stuff back in 2012, 2011. And early on, when I recruited students into my lab, it was all kind of based upon interdisciplinary interests of my students and postdocs. And some of them came from computer science, some came from physics. But really, I'm a chemist, I'm not a mathematician. And so we were learning a lot, and a lot of it we were learning the hard way. But then we started this wonderful collaboration with Bala Krishnamurthy in the math department at WSU, and we started embedding math students who were doing their kind of applied parts of their PhD in my group. And so here's Yun Feng, who got his PhD in 2018. We had a couple nice papers with him. Enrique is graduating in a couple weeks now. We've had a couple nice papers with him. Nate is now in my group. And these students, they come to my group meetings. They give math presentations in group meetings. My students, they have desks in my office. My chemistry students learn from them. They have shared projects together. And this really kind of embedded interdisciplinary approach has, I think, been much more effective and been really, really good, I think, for the chemistry people in my group, as well as the math students, because they learn some domain expertise. They learn some of these issues that we have in chemistry data. And so I just, I think it's really important because this, hopefully from the story that you've seen today, you can understand how kind of interwoven a lot of these concepts are that we have associated with data complexity in chemistry. And so with that, I just want to thank Bala, who's here in the audience, for being a great collaborator. And then there's my group from last year, pre-COVID. And this work was largely funded by the Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation, as well as some computing time from the Insight program and PNNL. And so with that, I am happy to answer any questions at all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aurora, for the inspiring talk. Let's briefly unmute ourselves and applaud for the speaker. So questions for Aurora?
There was a lot of information there, so.
Aurora, I'll start with a question. So I forget the name of it, but you had this iterative process for clustering, and then you showed this really nice picture with the red balls at the first layer.
Oh yeah, modularity optimization. Modularity optimization.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So many of the ideas there, multiscale and things like that. Of course, multiscale is everywhere in applied mathematics, but many of the concepts there are concepts that we're familiar with from the perspective of persistence, but you haven't incorporated persistence so much into that specific project. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct. Yeah, and so part of that is if you try to use persistent homology on just the point cloud data of like the interfaces, you're not going to see it, and it becomes swamped out by all the other data underneath, right? And so we didn't apply it to the Leonard-Jones system, but we have tried to apply it to the liquid-liquid interfaces, and it was just too much, basically. There's a lot of noise in the data, and so picking out kind of variations in structure on top of all of that noise became really, really challenging, which is why I think that kind of having this dual approach, and actually I think it's useful to try and find multiple ways to kind of get at identifying these structures is necessary, right? And so there's some limitations associated with the modularity optimization. And so the geometric measure kind of approach and the flat norm approach kind of has some benefits, and the modularity optimization has some benefits. Modularity optimization, you can just use, network X basically and pull out that module. It's super easy to use. The flat norm method requires more iteration, more thought about kind of probabilities associated with these features. It's not as black box. So in either case, I think that, I think I'm really excited to kind of compare. Once we have these structures identified, then we can look at the persistence aspects of them. But that data in and of itself, when we just tried to kind of very naively look at the persistent homology of it, was very, very complicated because the data was so noisy.
And in the modularity optimization, is it correct to say that you have some sort of global thing you're trying to optimize, like minimize,
the connectivities of the clusters? Yeah,
that's right. But in order to approximate this optimization problem, you do an iterative procedure. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it is. So it does take a little bit of time because you do go through like every single node in the graph to see whether, but it's also a really simple equation, so it goes through really quickly, right? I mean, it's evaluated really fast.
Thank you. Further questions?
I can ask one. So Aurora, you showed your graph theoretic approaches for many of the problems where you are capturing, pairwise interactions. Coming from the algebraic topology or computational geometry point of view, going from pairwise to multi-body, like 3-way, 4-way interactions, many times may give more information. is that, have you tried that in at least some of those, or is that a promising approach to try?
So, I mean, I would say that the pairwise interactions are used sometimes when you define edges in the graph, right?
Mhm.
But like the topological descriptors, I would say are many body topological descriptors, right?
Okay.
So like, it's really the pairwise piece only comes in really in the definition of the edge itself to construct the graph. But once you have the graph in place, then you're looking at the many body patterns that are present
Okay.
and the correlations in those patterns. So, you know, so this is where actually, you know, there's a huge diversity, right, of the types of descriptors that kind of go from kind of global and pairwise, like edge distributions, right? You could say that that's just a pairwise kind of descriptor, and we do use those. But I think that these, the reason why I brought up Pagerank as kind of a, from a spectral graph theory kind of perspective is it is one that is intrinsically a many body descriptor.
Okay.